Welcome to a new wave of entrepreneurship. I'm Latifa Farah, Associate Creative Producer at Venture for Canada and the producer of a new wave of entrepreneurship. The focus of this podcast is to hear from changemakers and Canadian entrepreneurs to learn about how they've developed their entrepreneurial mindset and skills. In Season 7, we'll be chatting with CEOs, founders, and successful business leaders about their career journeys. We're excited to dive into these conversations about how to foster your entrepreneur mindset and drive. On this episode, we're joined by Sam Duboc, the chair and co-founder of Pathways to Education Canada, an internationally recognized and award-winning nonprofit organization focused on improving the lives of Canada's disadvantaged youth and their communities through educational attainment. In this episode, Scott and Sam will discuss reducing the stigma around mental health.
We are incredibly excited to have Sam Duboc on Venture for Canada's podcast, A New Wave of Entrepreneurship. Sam, how are you doing this morning?
I'm terrific, and I'm super excited to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks so much for being on the program. You have such a wealth of experience across so many different sectors, from private equity to venture capital to the charitable nonprofit space. There are so many different topics to dive into. But first, one subject we want to explore is that of mental health, which is a topic that is of significant interest to our listeners as they think about their career paths and emerge from the pandemic. Sam, can you speak a little bit about your own mental health journey and how your mental health journey influenced you to found a mental health care company?
Happy to. Mental health is super important to me, fundamentally important to me. I grew up in the Midwest of the United States. I came to Canada when I started Air Miles. In the Midwest United States, in the time I grew up in the 70s, you don't really talk about mental health. You don't talk about weakness at all, frankly, in any aspect of it. It was very much of a stoic environment. And so as I built my career and I started to feel, understand things were happening, and I always fluctuate a little bit, I took a very stoic, very Midwest United States approach to it. You just gut through it, like suck it up, buttercup kind of stuff, and keep moving on. And I took that in, and I like to say that works very well. And the wall holds until the wall doesn't. And when the wall breaks, it breaks spectacularly well. And that for me happened, really the catalyst for the final catalyst. It happens over time. But the final catalyst was October 18th, 2011, when my brother died. He was walking to work in Zurich, Switzerland, and had a valve blowout and he died. I got the call at 7:34 in the morning from his daughter. He has a son, Sam. I assumed it was a misdial. She picked the wrong Sam. 2 minutes later, I get a call from my sister. I know something's up, and that thus begins my sort of, I will call, dive into a very deep depression. And interestingly, not only was I in depression, but obviously mixed with grief, but I knew exactly what was happening and why, because I'd been on the board of the Center for Addiction and Mental Health Foundation for years. I knew what was going on. I knew what drugs were effective. I knew what to look for. I had gone to the hospital and studied the mental health issue. I understood it. And notwithstanding all of that, it was extraordinarily difficult to get treatment. Getting access to someone, finding someone, then being able to leave your office at 2:00 to go to your appointment for 3:00 and not get back into 4:30 and have to tell your boss. All of that made it extremely difficult for me and for my family. And by the way, mental health affects not just you. It's not like strep throat, where if you have strep throat, if but for 6 or 7 days on the right prescription, you'll be better. It affects the whole family. The unknowability of the depth and duration is very difficult to handle. So as we were coming out of it, it was really my wife Claire's idea, saying, this is just so materially messed up and if we can't get treatment very easily, who else can? No one can get treatment. And so that led us on a journey to study it, which culminated 3 years later in Claire starting what at the time was CBT Associates and became MindBeacon over time.
Mental health is such an important topic, and it's important to recognize that most Canadians at some point in their life go through some kind of mental health challenge. That mental health is a spectrum that even if somebody doesn't have a mental illness or they're not going through a challenge, there's a high likelihood that at some point in someone's life, they're going to undergo some kind of mental health challenge. And something I've spoken publicly about on this podcast and other things is I've also gone through significant mental health challenges. I live with obsessive compulsive disorder. And when you talk about the wall break, I didn't realize I had OCD for a long time. And then I just reached a point where I basically couldn't function. And to your point about the challenges of accessing care, after doing some research, I learned that really the only way you can treat OCD is through exposure and ritual prevention at therapy. And doing research to actually find somebody who was an expert who all they do is treat this, that they were trained at the University of Pennsylvania, and going out and actually finding someone in Canada and then spending a lot of money to get that treatment. And I thought to myself, as a quite privileged person with access to resources, I found it challenging to access care. It took a ton of work and money and commitment by myself to go through that journey. And that's what in researching this interview, the work that you do and did, Sam, really resonated with me personally, because I've also lived it and I've seen how challenging it is for so many Canadians to access mental health care, including my own self. So thank you for the work that you're doing, because I know it makes a big difference in the lives of so many Canadians, that mental health care is more accessible.
Well, and thank you for that. That's very kind. But the other thing is we've got it. It's important. And the late Michael Wilson was a great man. He really helped doing it. The people at Bell, the people at CAMH, we have to make it so that people are accessing it before the wall breaks. I mean, the reality is that when you start having, everyone has issues. Anyone says they don't have issues, I would argue is not self-aware. All right, because everybody fluctuates, just a human condition, we fluctuate. But knowing it and understanding it and not being afraid to go and say, hey, or admit to yourself, hey, I'm feeling this way, and then go research what's getting out of it, that will solve a lot of it early. And if it was made so that people would access it super early, which is what we tried to do at MindBeacon, we felt like we could significantly shorten the duration and shorten the depth of the condition. Somebody's starting to feel down. Let's tell them what's going on. A, it's perfectly normal, acceptable. Something's not wrong with you necessarily. You are human. Number two is, here are some coping tools. Here's what care is. It's like I talked about at Pathways to Education for over many years. Is the overall goal of Pathways was give them the tools to help deal with it. Pathways, the charity that helps young kids graduate. Give them tools. Okay. Show them what's possible and show them you care. And if you do that in mental health, give them the tools, show them you care and what's possible to get out quickly, and someone who's there to care, one caring adult, you can make a material difference much more quickly and avoid depth and duration issues.
We've also interviewed Annette Verschuren on the Venture for Canada podcast, who is she might have overlapped with you on the board of the Center for Addiction and Mental Health.
Yeah, she's a great Canadian.
And she she is a wonderful Canadian and she's a supporter of Venture for Canada in a couple of different ways. And one of the things that Annette said to me on the podcast is that critical point, which is the importance of seeking mental health care early and quickly. And the challenge, I think, is that because of the stigma that exists around mental health care in our society, most people don't, including myself, don't go out and seek mental health care support until there's a breaking point, until they literally, in many cases, can't function. And that's where I think reducing the stigma on mental health care is something that's so important, because if we reduce the stigma, then people are more likely to seek healthcare sooner, which, by the way, I think is why it's so important that leaders like yourself and many more people in Canadian society, as well as the world, are honest about mental health challenges. Because the more that, in essence, people come out of the closet, if you will, about mental health challenges, the more that people see it and they can label it, and they can understand that everyone goes through challenges at different points. To your point, Sam, like Winston Churchill struggled with intense depression for much of his life. There were periods of time where he didn't get out of bed for months at a time. He called it the bad dog days. And when it's interesting, when we think about Winston Churchill, I bet you very few people know that Winston Churchill suffered from depression. People think of his, I will fight on the beaches, never, never, never give up. But he was a much more complex psychological person. So to kind of close it off, I want to say thank you for being so honest and candid in your stories. And a question I have for you is, how can everyday people work to reduce the stigma around mental health, around mental illness in the country?
Talk about, applaud it, and make it okay to say. Talk about it. Get it out there. Be open about your own struggles. Lead by example. And thank you for your comments about me, but that was one of the more difficult decisions of my life was deciding to go to out myself, if you will, on that. That wasn't what I was born with. And I had 40, at that point, almost 50 years or almost 50 years of life lived experience that taught me not to do that. Talk about it, get it out, make it okay, reach out. And when it happens, say it's okay, right? You've got to create a safe environment. A safe environment is an environment in which it's okay to talk about things that maybe were previously forbidden or previously taboo, and do it in a way that's inviting and open. I also think you have to do it in an environment, though, where people take personal responsibility. And that's one of the hallmarks of what we tried to do at MindBeacon, was to say, we're going to make mental health care available, accessible to all, and affordable to all. That's why we did the digital transformation of our business. That's why we ended up going to the type of payer arrangements we did, et cetera. But we also encouraged all of our people to take responsibility for their own health. Too often in Canada, I've been asked the difference between Canada and America a lot. Too often in Canada, we rely on the government or others to do things for us, right? It's more of a collectivist society than the US, where you don't have the supports that we have in Canada. And I would say in mental health, that's not the way to go. Mental health, we have to arm everybody with the tools they need, give them what's possible, and have them take personal responsibility for dealing, which is what, in fact, is a human condition that, as I said earlier, affects all of us. We teach arithmetic in school. Why are we not teaching wellness? Why are we not giving kids, so our ICBT platform, MindBeacon, why are kids not being taught that in 11th grade? How do you recognize you're going into depression? What's it look like? What do you do? How do you talk yourself out of it? How do you move? What are areas you can get access? We teach them to cope with language skills. We teach them to cope with arithmetic skills. We teach them to cope with increasingly economic skills, which is, I'm a huge fan of financial education. Okay, let's teach them mental health skills so that they can cope themselves, and they can then be self-reliant to solve it in a way, because the easiest way to solve it is to catch it earlier. The easiest way to catch it earlier is for you to catch it yourself.
Absolutely. I think most teenagers or most people can't really meaningfully define what our mental illness is. They might have heard the term depression, but unless they've gone through it, they don't necessarily know exactly what are the symptoms. How do you diagnose it?
Right.
How do you treat it? Even
right.
more importantly. And it's something that I think is so critical, and it's that question of how do we reduce that stigma, and ultimately, to your point, the importance of taking personal accountability. Reflecting on my own journey, I remember at the beginning, I would always thank going through the exposure ritual prevention, I would thank the therapist. Oh, thank you so much for helping me. And then around when I had my final session with her, because there's an end point to exposure ritual prevention, it doesn't go on forever. I remember I was reflecting a little bit in advance of the session, and I said, thank you for giving me the tools for how to more effectively cope with OCD. And I remember she just nodded her head, and it was like that journey over a long time. And it's recognizing, and I think that's a challenge a lot of people have, when at least I had going through mental health treatment, is it's not like some therapist or mental health professional waving a wand and like fixing your issue. It's you as an individual taking accountability for the fact that you have this illness, or you have this challenge you're going through, then you're going to do the hard work to manage and cope with it, and hopefully, feel better. But that no person can work to resolve the issue but yourself. And I think it's often like a misnomer around mental health, that people think someone else can solve it for them. All that someone else can do is help equip you with the tools to help yourself. So what you said really resonated with me, and thanks for sharing, Sam.
My pleasure. The thing I would add to it is, it's no different from the old saying is, give a guy a fish, you feed him for a day, teach them the fish, you feed them for a lifetime.
So can you describe in a little bit more detail about what is MindBeacon? What is CBT Associates? What are the kinds of services that your business offered, and how does CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, for those listening, how can CBT be a resource to help many people who are struggling with mental illness or mental health challenges?
So that's a great question. And as you know, we took the company public, and we sold it. Sold the public company earlier this year to another public company who's continuing to build on the success of the MindBeacon product, and the MindBeacon suite, I should say. I think the best way to start with that answer is cognitive behavioral therapy. And cognitive behavioral therapy is the really one of very few, and the family of CBT, which includes DBT. Now, I think the family of CBT is really the only proven through thousands of studies to be effective at reducing long-term depression, anxiety, and many other issues. Now, it's not for everything. It's not a bipolar solution. It's not a schizophrenia solution, although it's a great secondary solution in bipolar disease, but it's not the primary. But in cases of depression, anxiety, basically 75 to 80% of the mental health business, the mental health suffering, cognitive behavioral therapy has been taught to do that. So when we tried to figure that out, we studied the business and we said, and Claire said, CBT is the way to go. Why don't we build some CBT clinics, partner with some doctors to build clinics across Canada? In other words, trying to make it more accessible. And we began that journey, and we got up to about 6 clinics in Toronto area, and we were helping lots more people. But the reality was we were still helping people that had access to psychological benefits, that had access to capital, had access, could leave their job, and I can't overemphasize this, leave their job at 2:00 to get to the appointment at 3, to have the appointment till 4, and maybe get back to the job at 4:45. All right. The vast majority of Canadians can't do that for a lot of reasons, not the least of which is stigma. Everybody wants to know every week where you're going. All right. And so you can imagine as we were building that business, we're going, okay, we're being more effective, we're making it more accessible, more available, but we're not making it more affordable. And the reality is we could build 30 clinics and maybe help, tens and tens of thousands of people. But if we could figure out a way to scale ubiquitously, we could. And so the CBT clinics were started by Doctors Denisoff and Farbolden. We partnered with them and we scaled those out. And as we were doing that, Dr. Farbolden and others were saying, hey, there's new technology in the States. It's actually been around for a long time about digitizing CBT, but no one really picked up on it. In fact, he did a study back in 2004 where he looked at the potential for digitizing CBT. And so we looked at it, and that's when we really became MindBeacon. And really, we took that and said, okay, this is the way to go. If you do the fulsome study on what patients need, they need a continuum of care. Nobody's the same. So whereas you needed I'm guessing 12 to 14 to 16 session capability in what you went through, all right, some people just need a little bit of information. They just want to know, hey, am something wrong with me, right? Or, hey, what is this? Some people need, just some coaching and some tools. Some people need that person that cares, need to talk to someone. But some people actually need to be crisis management and in situ care, right? So what we said, MindBeacon, the hallmark of MindBeacon, I think why we became successful was we built the full step continuum of care into our entire platform. So we could help most people who were suffering from 80% of the conditions in mental health. We could help them. And the importance of that was that we were taking the ones that I'll call middle of the fairway depression. And I don't mean to demean it. At the end of the day, my doctor described me as middle of the fairway depression. Felt really bad at the time, but I was depressed, and there wasn't anything super magical about it. I was kind of, if you look at the depression case history and settings, I was kind of just right down the middle. I had it. They knew I had it. It's pretty clear what we need to do. We can take those kind of people out and digitize that experience so it makes it easier for you and much less resource intensive for the sector, leaving the highly capable psychologists, psychiatrists, of which you could never solve the problem with humans, there just aren't enough, to deal with the more infirmed cases. And that's what we did. We created a stepped approach to care to do that. Claire built the business around it, began to do it. As we started to grow, it became more and more of a family endeavor as I got involved. And my capabilities in private equity and other such made sense for me to take the lead of the business as we began capital raising and the strategic change of the business, et cetera. And really, Claire and I partnered with the doctors and over time with lots of other wonderful people to build the business.
Can you describe in a little bit more detail the science of cognitive behavioral therapy for our listeners who might know nothing about CBT? What is CBT? How does it work? How can it positively impact people?
So at a 30,000-foot level, because I'm not a psychologist, as they say, I wouldn't play one on TV either. Cognitive behavioral therapy is based on the concept of stoicism that goes back into the 50s and 60s. It was developed in the 60s and 70s, proven out of the 80s and 90s and 2000s. And what essentially it does is think of it as really a learning tool to help you define what it is, understand what's happening to you, provide you with the tools and capabilities and practice to do it, and walks you through a series of modules. Depending on how you structure it, we structure it as an infinite number of modules. You could do 1, 2, 20, 50, a lot of them, to structure it in such a way that it starts with someone who has really no understanding, but has a feeling what they're doing, help them understand first what's happening to them, and then provide them the tools and the options and the capabilities to regulate themselves. You can do those without intervention from a professional. You can do it with intervention from a professional. You can do it in person. Our data from the MindBeacon system said if you automated that and made the interaction to be a digital interaction, so not an interaction that was live like you and I are having, but a digital interaction, and you made it an asynchronous interaction where where people would do it on their own time, you dramatically lowered the barriers of cost, of time pressures. We were super busy at midnight because people would wake up, and having issues. A lot of times I used to call it the ugly head would rear itself at 3:30 in the morning, and I'd be up the rest of the night, right? It allows you to get on when, where, how you want it and do it in your time frame in a very cost-effective manner. And so using a tool of cognitive behavioral therapy, combining it with convenience, eliminating the whole concept of the hour and the location, so eliminating need for location and eliminating need for a specific time, really the combination of those led to the type of results that we've had.
Beyond CBT and recognizing that CBT is a clinically proven, incredibly helpful tool at addressing mental illness and mental health challenges, what are other protective factors that you think that you suggest listeners leverage, or that you might have potentially leveraged in your life around improving mental health? As an example, and for clarity, like going for a walk is an example.
Yeah. So everyone's different. There's a lot of things that people do, and we used to laugh because people would talk about what they were doing, etc. It was kind of fun for us because we hear a whole bunch of different stories. For me, it comes down first and foremost to my partner and spouse and life partner and wife. She has been unbelievably important for me, and I can only speak to me in this case. I can speak to what the data says, but I'll speak to me as the question. Number 2 was really engaging in a meaningful way with friends, and it doesn't mean go get a huge friend group, but engaging meaningfully. And I don't mean meaningfully by trying to solve your problem, but meaningful in a way that is you're out doing things with people, you're interacting with people, you're getting out of the house. I'm a huge proponent, get people back in the office. Why? Because I just think business is better in the office when you're collaborating and you have that sort of walking by, someone says, hey, what about this? That's harder to do in Zoom. But also for mental health purposes. Being on your earphones in front of a screen all day is not positive and not great for your mental health. Mental health and mood and anxiety disorders are helpful around lots of people. And then third is, clearly exercise works, get out of the house, go take a run, go take a walk, do whatever you do. And diet matters a lot, because you don't want to feel bad about yourself if you just ate 2 handfuls of M&Ms, which I guiltily did last night. So,
and sometimes it's good to splurge and to have a little treat to the point. But all those things are examples that resonate for me as well. And when 2 things I think to build on. First is I think the importance of partners. I think a lot of the times, probably one of the most important decisions that most people make in their life for their mental health, for their happiness, for their overall life quality is who they pick as a partner. And to your point, I think it's often underappreciated the extent to which that will have an impact on someone's mental health long-term. And I appreciate you sharing that. The second one is to mention a study, which I'm sure you're probably very aware of, which is the Harvard Happiness Project, which shows that the most important long-term impact of happiness, according to this, I think, 80-year longitudinal study of different individuals, is the extent to which they have close personal relationships with other people that are healthy. And I think that that's why, for a variety of reasons, the pandemic was so hard on people. We're inherently social creatures.
Look, that's right. I mean, that and purpose are super important aspects to feeling good about yourself. And when you say healthy, that's what I was trying to get. Like, that's a much better way of putting it. So thank you for that. Is the relationship's not based on going to your friends and saying, I need help, I'm depressed. It's going and having good, mutually beneficial relationships that you can build on each other's strengths. I think what you say is super important. And, the last thing, which I didn't mention, which, for me increasingly is important, is it's okay to have a bad day. It's just a bad day. And if that's all it is, then don't start at 8 o'clock in the morning because you wake up depressed saying, God, it's going to be a bad day, and let it go, okay, it's a bad day. I recognize what it is. I'm not going to stress about it. Now, if I end up stringing together 14 bad days, which is the definition of depression, or the true definition of depression, or if I start stringing away more and more bad days. But if you have a bad day, it's okay to have a bad day.
An excellent book that I read in March, April of this year, which is kind of a self-help book, which I generally am not a huge fan of self-help books, but this book I really loved. It's called Awareness by Anthony DeMello. And he was a Catholic priest, but based in India. So he kind of brings together different spiritual traditions. The book was actually listed as the Catholic Church as not a Catholic book because there was a lot of confusion around it, because it brings together a lot of different faith traditions and different things. And the book, by the way, is very, it's 40,000 good reads. It's not an obscure book. So to say that, I'm not the first to recommend it, but he has a great line in it where the book's only around 160 pages long. And he says that he still gets depressed, he still gets anxious, he still has all these feelings. It's to be aware of those feelings, and it's to accept those feelings deeply. And it's to recognize that part of being human is feeling really difficult things. And I think it relates to a New York Times article I read last year, which was a psychiatrist talking about, in her view, one of the main issues of why psychological problems emerge is when people don't want to feel difficult things. So it's when we say, oh, I can't feel sad, or I can't feel anxious. And instead, I'm going to try to run away from those feelings. So to say to, I think, our listeners, and I think an important takeaway is, it's okay to be sad. It's okay to be anxious. It's okay to be angry. One of the things that's important is to understand and to be aware of those emotions. So as a question for you, Sam, to what extent is mindfulness, which is in essence that ability to be aware of what you're thinking, to be aware of how you're feeling, how is that a protective factor? How is that a critical component of fostering positive mental health?
So I wish you would have started the podcast instead of the question you asked me, because that DeMello quote is perfect. I mean, it's absolutely perfect what you just quoted from that book. So I'm going to read that book. I think wellness is super important. I'm trying to phrase it perfectly. Let me just say what I think. I think it's very important, but I don't think it's prescriptive in the sense that there is a fixed path that wellness means. Again, I have this saying, which I've copied. This is not by no means proprietary or original in my part. You do you, and it's so important in mental health. You do you. It's so important because little things might just be perfect for you. Like, I'll sit and just stop. 5 minutes of just stopping. I'm not meditating. I'm not turning on stuff. I'm just stopping. And I may step outside. I may go sit in a different chair, but I just stop for 5 minutes. It's a great perspective and calming tool. Breathing, super important. Learning how to breathe. The breathing app, actually, on the iWatch is actually pretty good. But just breathing and being conscious of your inner self for just a few minutes, a couple times a day. And then, of course, getting exercise to release the body tension, which is natural when you're sitting all day, is important. But it's finding that combination of things that work for you. And, to echo the conversation going onward, it's okay for it not to work originally. It's okay to have trial and failure. It's okay, right? That's part of the human condition. I mean, as I say, Ted Williams, the greatest batter in human history in baseball, hit 400, slightly less 400 lifetime. And he was best. Tiger Woods, at the absolute pinnacle of his career, won a third of the tournaments in 1 year, which will never be matched in the male game again. Although Margaret Court in tennis, I think, won something like 60% of tournaments in 1 year back in her era, which again, will never be matched in the women's era and certainly not in the open era. So, failure is just part of it. But it's failure in business, it's failure in life, it's failure in your mental health. It's how you accept it and move on and learn from it. That's key.
Agreed. To fail is human, and I think that to accept that, there's a great book by the Pulitzer Prize winning Catherine Schultz that it is called Being Wrong, and it's about the history of being wrong, and it reminded me a little bit about what you're saying, and I think it's a great book for people to check out. One thing that I found perplexing over the last decade, and this is something that happened even before the pandemic, is that there has been a massive crisis of mental health amongst teenagers. And the pandemic accelerated this, but it was happening before the pandemic, but for people of all genders. And New York Times and lots of news outlets have been focusing more on this issue, that because it is, the amount of hospitalizations of teenagers is up like 2 or 3 times what it was like a decade ago. Why do you think that there is this explosion of mental health care challenges, in particular as it relates to young people?
Okay, I think you gotta double click on that a little bit. And what I would double click on that a little bit is I would say 2 things. Number one is there was always a certain amount, and I would say a lot, of depression, anxiety among young people. They just didn't talk about it. They would never admit it, and their parents, for God's sakes, would never admit it. Okay, back in the old days. I can tell you in India, where I grew up, no, that was a no-fly zone, okay, in the family. So I think one of what you're seeing is, which I think is great, is the elimination of stigma, making it okay to talk about, making it okay to acknowledge it. So I think you're naturally seeing more of it because more people are willing to admit it, number one. Which I think is a part of it that's not talked about enough. But the other thing which is clear, and by no means am I the expert on it, but it's clear, is in my day, if I was being bullied or people were talking poorly about me, etc., I'd just go to a different playground. I'd go shoot baskets. I'm from Indiana, so I shot a lot of baskets when I was a kid in basketball. I'd go shoot baskets in, a different street. You can't get away from it today. I mean, social media is extraordinarily harmful to children. And actually, I wonder in the end of the day is what's the net. No one I am not aware of a net beneficial gain, return on investment kind of thinking of social media, but it really is harmful to a lot of kids. And a lot of kids can't take, whether it's the FOMO, they weren't invited to the party, or whether it's the outright bullying, or whether it's even worse. And we've seen examples of that, the person out east, for instance. It really has elevated, and it's also done it in a way in which there's no time for which to put context around it. The amping up of the speed is, I'd get bullied at school, I'd go home, and 2 days later, 3 days later, I'd see the kid again, but I'd have time to put context, think about, etc. Here, you're bullied on social media, and before you have time to do anything else, your people are piled on. And so, I think those are the kind of causes, but I wouldn't underestimate also the point that, which I take quite a bit of happiness in, that the stigma is coming off in the teenage group, and the young people are more willing to talk about it than my age group is. And then, if you acknowledge something, you have to do something about it. And I think that's part of what's transpiring. So the other interesting thing about it, because in your the type of business you're in the podcast, is we're talking a lot about mental health, the importance of mental health. I think it's also recognized that if you're going to do something to help someone with mental health, you have to do it in an economically sustainable manner. When we decided to do something about it, we discussed, should we just do a charitable foundation or should we make it a business? And the thing that drove us to business was, not the return for us, but it had to be sustainable. At Pathways, we raised, you can look it up, $40-50 million a year. Got to do that every year. It's hard work. We did it. It was hard work. We need to create a business that could make mental health sustainable. And so, doing the causal stuff and making sure that the cause works in the economic environment to make it sustainable, that allow you to attract funding, and resources to build on it is an extremely important aspect of solving the mental health problem. Simply throwing dollars at it in a way that does not have an effective business model will not work, and I would in fact say harmful over time.
Really interesting points about the rise of mental health care challenges in young people, and to the point that reduced stigmatization has an impact also in the extent to which the issue is at least more public. I certainly find, I'm 31, so I'm a millennial, and I find that even people 10 years younger than me, Gen Z, there's so much more willingness and openness to talk about therapists that they're going to or mental health challenges that they're experiencing. A second point that I think is interesting is that impact of social media. Speaking personally, I decided to stop using Instagram and Facebook around 14, 15 months ago. And I have noticed a discernible positive impact on my own mental health. And I've reflected about that a little bit in terms of young people. I came of age, I got Facebook when I was in grade 12. So most of my high school experience, there was no social media. And I think back to if social media existed when I was in high school, some of the challenges that I would have potentially experienced. Sam, we've covered a really wide range of topics today. Thank you so much for your candor, for the work that you've done to promote access to mental health care in the country, as well as for sharing your own experiences in reducing the stigma around mental health and mental illness. We really appreciate you coming on the podcast today. Thanks so much.
Hey, thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it, and I love the work you're doing.
That's it for this week's episode of A New Wave Entrepreneurship. Stay connected with us via our socials and our email list. Subscribe to us in your favorite podcast app so that you don't miss our next episode. If you have feedback on today's episode, tweet us at Venture for Canada, that is Venture, the number 4, Canada, or email us at podcastadventure@canada.ca. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening. I'm Latifa Farah, and that was Scott Sterrett and Sam Duboc. Until next time, stay safe, stay motivated, and stay grateful. A New Wave of Entrepreneurship is produced by Latifa Farah, and editing and mixing are also done by Latifa Farah. Basola Agamba is our editorial assistant. Mark Wallach and Premium Beat own the copyright and publishing rights related to the song used in this podcast.